Hello, everyone. I want to welcome everyone to today's workshop. It's actually on Resettlement Action Plan. My name is Peter Kenele-Agabwe. I hope this contribution would meet your expectation. I hope this contribution would meet your expectation. As we can see from the pictures displayed above, this is a picture showing the last resettlement action plan that I participated in within a community around Kaduna. And before we proceed with the workshop proper, I want us to first of all have an understanding of what resettlement is all about. Resettlement, as defined by IFC, is the disruption and displacement of communities resulting from project-related land acquisition, restrictions on land use. Resettlement can be classified as either voluntary or involuntary, and may be either physical or economical. Resettlement is considered to be involuntary when affected persons, that is the project affected persons or community, do not have the right to refuse. And this was the definition as presented by IFC Performance Standard 5, 2015. The World Bank disclosed that projects related to land acquisition, restriction on land use can have adverse impacts on communities and persons. Project-related land acquisition or restriction on land use may cause physical displacements, relocation, loss of residential land or loss of shelter, economic displacements, loss of land, loss of assets, loss of source of income. And what are the objectives of RAP? The objectives of RAP are, number one, to avoid involuntary resettlement, or when unavoidable, minimize involuntary resettlements. Involuntary resettlement by exploring project design alternatives. To avoid forced eviction, eviction is not considered to be forced eviction if it conforms to national law, including compliance with and completion of all relevant legal and administrative procedures, complies with all relevant requirements of the World Bank, and to mitigate unavoidable adverse social and economic impacts on land acquisition and restriction on land, to improve living condition of poor or vulnerable persons who are physically displaced through provisions of adequate housing, access to services and facilities, and security of tenure. Now, when I say security of tenure, I mean that resettled individuals or communities are settled to a site that they can legally occupy, where they are protected from the risk of eviction, and where the tenure rights provided to them are socially and culturally appropriate. Now, let's look at the scope of this application, the scope of the application of RAP. It applies to permanent or temporary physical and economic displacements resulting from the following types of land acquisition or restriction on land use undertaken or imposed in connection with project implementation. Land rights or land use rights acquired or restricted through expiration or other compulsory procedure in accordance with national law, land rights or land use rights acquired or restricted through negotiated settlements by property owners or those who have rights to land. So all these are covered within the scope of the RAP. Restriction on land use. This may include a situation where legally designated protected areas such as forests, biodiversity areas, or buffer zones are established in connection with the project. So restriction on land use and access to natural resources that cause a community or group within the community to lose access to natural resources usage where they have traditionally or customary tenure or recognizable usage rights. Relocation of people without formal, traditional, or recognizable usage rights who are occupying or utilizing land prior to a project's specific cut-off dates. Displacement of people as a result of project impacts that render their land unusable or inaccessible. All these are covered within the scope of RAP. Restriction on access to land or use of other resources, including communal properties and natural resources such as marine and aquatic resources, timber, non-timber forest products, freshwater, medicinal plants, hunting and gathering ground, and grazing and cropping areas. Land rights or claims to land or resources replenished by individual, relinquished by individuals or communities without full payment of compensation, and land acquisition or land use restriction occurring prior to the project, but which were undertaken or initiated in anticipation of or in preparation for the project. So all these are covered within the scope of RAP. So any project affected person or community that comes within this scope can be recognized as an eligible person or community to participate in this process. The next, we're looking at eligibility classification. Affected persons may be classified as persons who, number one, have formal legal rights to land or access, or number two, may not have formal legal rights to land or assets, but have a claim to the land or asset that is recognizable or unrecognizable under the national law, or who have no recognizable legal rights or claim to the land or assets they occupy and use. So the status of the affected persons can be verified through detailed inventory accounts derived through a consultative, impartial, and transparent process of the full range of rights held by affected persons, including those based on custom or practice, secondary rights such as right of access or use of livelihood purpose, rights held in common. So all these are indications of eligibility of project affected persons or community. Compensation for affected persons when the land acquisition or restriction on land use cannot be avoided. The land use may either be temporary land use or permanent land use. Also, it should be noted that at the request of affected persons, it may be necessary to acquire entire land parcel if partial acquisition would render the remaining economically unviable or make the remaining parcel unsafe or inaccessible for human use or occupation. Project owner or borrower as taxed by the World Bank will take project owner or borrower as taxed by the World Bank will possess and acquire the land only after compensation and where applicable, displaced persons have been resettled and moving allowance may have been provided to displaced persons. Community engagement process is very important because decision-making process related to resettlement and livelihood restoration will include options and alternatives from which affected persons may choose. Disclosure of relevant information and meaningful participation of affected communities or persons will take place during the consideration of alternative project designs and thereafter throughout the planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of the compensation process, livelihood restoration activities, and the relocation process. The consultation process should ensure that women's perspectives are obtained and their interest factored into all aspects of resettlement planning and implementation. Addressing the livelihood impacts may require intra-household analysis in case where women's and men's livelihood are affected differently. Women's and men's perspective in terms of compensation mechanisms such as replacement of land or alternative access to natural resources rather than in cash should be explored. For grievance mechanism for the project to address specific concerns about compensation, relocation, or livelihood restoration measures raised by displaced persons in a timely fashion. That's very important. It should be in a timely fashion. Where possible, such grievance mechanisms will utilize existing formal or informal grievance mechanisms suitable for project purposes. The planning and implementation, where land acquisition or restriction on land use are unavoidable, the project proponents will, or the mineral title holder will conduct a census to identify the persons who will be affected by the project, to establish an inventory of land and assets to be affected, to determine who will be eligible for compensation and assistance, and to encourage ineligible persons such as optimistic settlers, to discourage ineligible persons such as optimistic settlers from claiming benefits. The social assessment will also address the claims of communities or groups who, for valid reasons, may not be present in the project area during the time of the census, such as seasonal resource users. And this will include posted warnings that the persons settling in the project area after the cutoff dates may be subject to removal. Of physical displacement, in the case of physical displacement, The plan will be designed to mitigate the negative impacts of displacement and, as warranted, to identify development opportunities. Particular attention will be paid to gender aspects and to the needs of the poor and the vulnerable. All the transactions of the acquired land rights, provision of compensation, and other assistance associated with relocation activities are to be properly documented. Will include, and this should include, a resettlement budget and implementation schedule, and establish the entitlement of all categories of affected persons. Particular attention should be paid to gender aspects and the needs for the poor and the vulnerable. The mineral title holder will document all transactions to acquire land rights, provision of compensation, and other assistance associated with relocation activities. The payment and procedure for compensation. The following principles should be followed for payments of compensation for lost assets. Under the World Bank policies, such cash compensation is only appropriate when there is an active market in the land or housing where such assets are actually available for purchase. So compensation shall be paid prior to acquisition or displacement. The compensation for structure shall include the full cost of materials and labor required for reconstructing a building or similar surface and standing. Compensation compensates all the project affected persons adequately for properties and income loss. The procedure for delivering compensation shall include full payment of compensation carried out before possession of acquired sites. Necessary documents for payments to the affected persons should be presented to local land asset valuation committee for the local government or other independent witness of the affected persons and the leaders of the communities. Proper receipts issued and copies given to affected persons. As we're running up on this, it's very important we look at some of the good practices for resettlement. The first one is a community-managed resettlement process. This is a good one. This is a good practice of RAP around the world. It does not mean mere community participation, but community control and its ownership of resettlement program. The more the resettlement program is community and collective centered, the greater the chance of it succeeding. And public hearing and reviews are widely used strategies to enable people to participate in the decision-making processes. Social impact assessments, the assessment of any project from environmental and social points of view brings estimation of effects of projects on aggrieved persons. Defined eligibility for benefits and resettlement and development program of negatively affected persons. These are good practices. And finally, we conclude by clearly stating that a comprehensive resettlement action plan is key to successful planning, implementation, and management of projects affected persons. Thank you for your time. I hope this is helpful. For more information, visit our website, www.richflood.com. For inquiries, send us an email at info@richflood.com. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.